everyone to the Landmark College's speaker series. The speaker series is free and open to the public, and so Landmark College would like to thank the sponsors that help us make this possible. This year's sponsors are SoberNet Communications, Leader Distribution Systems, the Richards Group, and Green Mountain Tent Rentals. While I've got your attention, I'd like to have you mark your calendars for our next speaker, Sandglass founding director Eric Bass, who will be speaking on November 6th right here on puppets and social justice. This will be the wrap-up for a residency that Sandglass is doing here at Landmark College the week before. And there will be a public performance in the Greenhoe Theater on Saturday, November 4th at 7:30 of their production Babylon, which is about refugee journeys, in which they worked closely with Vermont refugee resettlement in collecting, collating, and producing stories of refugees. So that performance is on Saturday, November 4th at 7:30, not in this venue, but across the quad in the Greenhoe Auditorium. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dan Toomey. Dan's just come off of a sabbatical, studying and writing on the mentorships of Robert Frost. Dan's connection to Robert Frost began early as he recognized the precision of Frost's connection to and description of the New England landscape that he himself was living and growing up in. This connection deepened and strengthened through Dan's study of Frost, Frost's poetry, and Frost's life. Now, with no further ado, please welcome Dan Toomey.
Thank you. I said, I think the talk will take about 40 to 45 minutes, something like that. So we'll have time for questions and answers afterward. It concerns, as Adrian said, Frost's role as a mentor, that is, as a guide, a teacher, a person who takes an interest in and offers advice to a younger person. In the first part, I'll speak generally about Frost's mentoring. The second part will focus on a particular mentorship that I have long found particularly compelling, in part because it resulted in the creation of one of Frost's greatest poems. I want to move this. I want to bring some relevancy to this this idea by bringing the whole matter closer to home. Much of Frost's life was also about teaching and learning, and he spent more time at colleges and universities than any writer of his generation. In the spring of 1917, a young student named Walter Hendrix entered one of Frost's classes at Immerse College and immediately fell under his influence. Through direct instruction then and through conversation over many years afterward, he absorbed Frost's ideas about education. As a teacher himself and later as a college administrator, he was able to put many of these ideas to practical use. Embracing the Frostian notion of risking spirit in substantiation, he eventually founded Windham College. Hendrix called Robert Frost his greatest teacher, and by way of tribute, the first building planned for this campus was to be named Robert Frost Hall. The groundbreaking took place in the spring of 1961, and Frost himself turned the first shovel full of earth. This is the photograph we have from that day. We have this photo hanging in Robert Frost Hall up on the hill. A late faculty member, Robert Fay, photoshopped it for us, and he was able to take the sticker off of the shovel. Myself, I like it there because it reminds me that we may still owe the Putney General Store for that. That's kind of an inside joke for the people from Marlboro who came. And I can't really talk about it to the rest of you, except over beer maybe. So anyway, we can thus trace our presence in the room tonight back to this one example of Frost mentoring. I want to offer some further thoughts on why looking into Frost's role as a mentor is important, these having to do with his character and his art. There are a number of ingredients that go into being a good mentor, one of which is loyalty. This is to say that the mentor has to be loyal to the person he or she is mentoring. If there is a principal virtue that Frost's life embodied, demonstrated through both his thinking and his actions, it is loyalty. Some of his best-known poems indicate his readiness to approach the idea from varied perspectives. Into My Own, which concerns devotion to the self, Reluctance, which underscores the idea that fidelity to a love or a season is a human impulse difficult to surrender, and Mending Wall, in which unwavering adherence to tradition is called into question. The concept of loyalty appears in varying forms throughout Frost's entire body of poetry, occasionally in his prose writing and also in his public talks, most notably one titled Speaking of Loyalty, which was delivered at Amherst College in the spring of 1947. Well, he once stated, "I want people to read and study my poetry, not myself. I'm transient, incidental. It's my poetry that counts." His life and art were inextricable, as William Pritchard's recently reissued Robert Frost, A Literary Life Reconsidered, convincingly demonstrates, and a large part of that life were his friendships and the loyalty expressed in them. His mentoring of aspiring younger poets, as well as any younger persons who look to him for advice and guidance, are consummate expressions of this virtue. Now, just a word about the term mentorship. In his biography, Robert Frost, A Life, J. Perini recounts a brief exchange between Edward Connery Latham, who accompanied Frost to England in 1957. He was, by the way, a much-loved librarian at Baker Library at Dartmouth, and he edited the complete volume of Frost poetry prior to Frost's death. He got into a bit of trouble for over-punctuating it, but that's another story. Accompanied Frost to England in 1957, and the wife of T.S. Eliot. So this is Edward Connery Latham talking to the wife of T.S. Eliot. Conversation took place at a black-tie dinner given in Frost's honor the evening of June 11th of that year. This is J. Perini. At this point, while Frost was slowly making his way to Eliot's side, Mrs. Eliot asked that Latham move temporarily into what had been Frost's place. As he did so, she said, speaking softly, "We did not have a chance to chat with one another before dinner. However, I noticed that you talked with my husband, and I do know who you are." She then added, "You are a protege of Mr. Frost." Latham demurred, and when told that Frost himself was the source of this identification, replied, "Mr. Frost would have said to you, Ed Latham is one of my boys, and that's not the same thing as a protege." Smiling, Mrs. Eliot conceded, "Yes, that is what he said, that you are one of his boys." While Frost's own term, "my boys," evinces the informality and paternal intimacy that characterize virtually all of his deepest friendships with younger men, I choose a more precise term universally understood, mentorship. A mentor is a person who teaches, gives help, and offers advice to younger and less experienced persons as a way of helping them realize their potential. Mentorships, while more formal than My Boys, captures with considerable more precision the full sense of these relationships, many of which lasted decades. Frost critic Donald Sheehy tells us that, quote, "Frost assumed the role of mentor habitually, without hypocrisy or calculation, as an act naturally continuous with the experience of teaching and parenting." Mentoring could also be considered a species of friendship, and good friendships, like good mentorships, are comprised not only of loyalty, but also generosity, kindness, and humility. Although individual personality and circumstance varied their expression, each of these virtues was present within the context of Frost's mentoring of all those he befriended, one of whom had this to say regarding his own experience: "Never have I known anyone else who could be so self-effacing while dealing with another's problems. It used to embarrass me when he tried to help resolve mine, since I didn't consider them important enough to warrant such unmitigated attention as he gave them for hours on end. So now we move on to Frost and walking. Solvitur ambulando, this is a Latin expression that I learned in teaching my pilgrimage course. And it means, as it says there, it is solved by walking or by wandering. And you can really think about it on two levels. That is that the idea of physical activity helps our thought process, which is a really ancient idea. The other is that the wandering can take place in the mind. That is free association. So really, it's both things are happening at the same time. Psychologists today have a term, transient hypofrontality, which means a positive state of mind brought on by physical exertion during which thoughts intermingle freely. Once again, modern science reaffirms the wisdom of the ancients. It is important to understand that Frost's mentees were often enlisted as walking companions during which their physical stamina was consistently tested. There are many stories of students insisting on walking Frost home after a late night discussion, and this is how it worked. So they leave wherever they are, the classroom, and he liked to persuade administrators to let him run his classes late at night. Well, maybe not late at night. They lasted until late at night, but they might have started at 7 o'clock or so. And the students who wanted to could stay as long as they wanted afterward. So around midnight, that was time to adjourn for real, and they looked at him and said, "We'll walk you home." So they walk him home, and they get to his house 20 or 25 minutes later. Frost turns to them and says, "What? Who's going to walk you home?" So there's only one answer to that question, right? So it's back here again. And anyway, it's the beginning of a very, very long but memorable night, I think. There was a lot of back and forth. Frostian duality comes in there too, I think, but I'm not sure that was intentional. I've walked, I've taken a kind of an interest in these mentoring paths, and one that I know pretty well is the one that begins at a fraternity house in Amherst and goes up Boltwood Avenue past the Lord Jeff Inn to the police station. Then you take a left on Amity Street and cross North Pleasant, and then go down the other end of Amity Street down to Dana Street, which was where he had his rented house. Where he had his rented house the spring of 1917. And I've walked that. It took me over half an hour, and I was kind of tired by the end of it. But I want you to know I didn't do that at 2 or 3 in the morning. I haven't reached that level of frostbite yet. I think it's coming. Here is the selflessness, a virtue we can see again and again throughout his life. To 2 young men seeking his approval for the choices they were making, he had this to say: "You can only please me by pleasing yourself, and your success is my success." Allied to all of this was Frost's readiness to calibrate his discourse to his listener or fellow conversationalist level of interest and understanding. We see the same trait revealed in his letters, public addresses, and interviews. And here, in a sense, was the teacher in him reflecting in different form that same selflessness. Robert Frost mentored hundreds over the course of his long life. A partial list of the most notable would include John Bartlett, John Ciardi, Melville Cohn, Peter Davison, Henry Dirks, Kimball Flaccus, Charles Foster, Robert Francis, Donald Hall, James Hurst, Putney's own Walter Hendrix, Thomas Hornsby Harrell, John Holmes, Gardner Jackson, Edward Connery Latham, Robert Lowell, William Meredith, Charles Mullum, Theodore Ruthke, Merrill Root, Hugo Saglio, David Schubert, Peter Stanless, and Richard Wilbur. I know it's all men, and I'll speak to Frost and gender equity, I think, in the Q&A period. I don't have any solid answers for that, but just some ideas. Before continuing, I want to take a small detour here to say something about Robert Frost and the vital role that figures of speech played in his thinking. Frost was not the first to argue that all thinking was metaphorical, as he acknowledged that analogy, simile, comparison, contrast, parallel, allusion, and paradox were all forms of saying one thing in terms of another. But he also included ambiguity, wit, humor, irony, puns, understatement, hyperbole, parable, plot, myth, image, banter as forms of analogy. But his favorite figure of speech was the synecdoche, and I'm going to put that definition up here. The part standing for the whole, most often. When pressed once to confirm what school of poetry he belonged to, he playfully told the inquisitor that he was a synecdochist. He explained once the power of synecdoche through a clever analogy that plays off the name of an upstate New York utility company conveniently named, guess what, Schenectady Power and Light. So Schenectady is the Iroquois for place of the pines or place of pines, but Frost's fondness for wordplay allowed him to work off the place name's homonymic similarity to the word synecdoche. So whenever you switch on a light switch, I'll just show this. There's Schenectady Power and Light. A light bulb is illuminated, and it is illuminated unless you produce your own electricity, because the bulb is connected to a power grid and ultimately to an energy source, neither of which is visible usually to the person who turned on the light. The electrical grid, the energy source, the utility company, although millions of times larger than the light bulb, remain unseen, sending out power to illuminate the moment the bulb is switched on. The illuminated light bulb then becomes the part standing for the whole, the part in place of the whole. So I introduce synecdoche for a reason. Of all Frost mentorships, there are a small number that stand out for their depth, their longevity, and what resulted from them. Frost's decades-long relation with one young man from Dearborn, Michigan was one of these. His name was Wade Vandor. The rest of my talk tonight will focus synecdochally on this mentorship in particular. Frost said, all an artist needs are samples. And here is one such sample. So, in 1915 in Dearborn, Michigan, Wade Vandor, then 15 years old and in the 9th grade, decided to end his formal education. He simply packed up what he wanted in his school desk and went home, reflecting later, I had left school like a sleepwalker, and not until 4 years later, while working at the J.B. Sheehan bookstore in Detroit, did I wake up. This eventual rise to consciousness was brought about by a propitious encounter in the bookstore's basement storeroom with an 11-volume set of the writings of an author he had never heard of, Henry David Thoreau. Passing the books each day for weeks on errands to the basement, his curiosity was whetted by the titles on the bindings until the day came when he could hold off no more. He chose to open Autumn first, and then the plain, unrhetorical writing instantly transferred me to the next level of my earthly existence. It was a literary case of love at first sight. As an employee, he was allowed to buy all of the books at cost, 1 volume a week. Thoreau's keen awareness of and sensitivity to the natural world, along with his anti-materialism, struck a chord so resonant that it set for him a clear course for the rest of his life. In the years between his dropping out of school in Dearborn and clerking at a bookstore in Detroit, Wade Vandor shoveled gravel out of railway gondolas, made geranium cuttings, pushed wheelbarrows, picked apples, and did rough carpentry. In the fall of 1921, with his mother's lukewarm approval, he headed north with his good friend Ed Long for the wilderness of Ontario. The flexibility offered by seasonal labor would allow him to spend the fall and early winter months of the years 1921 through 1929 in the Canadian woods, living off of the land and the water. As he explains in his memoir, certainly the North became a symbol of unclutteredness and moral purity, which I later associated with Thoreau. And I'll show you a picture here. So the fella on your left here, who looks like he's headed for a Grateful Dead concert, that is Wade Vandor, the summer of 1922. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but he's barefoot. He's got shorts and a rather seasoned hunting shirt and long hair, more or less parted in the middle, and a beard. I didn't know that anyone was allowed to look like that in 1922. This is the same man 4 years later. So they're both photos were taken on the Lake Shindabowen in Ontario. His wilderness experiences during those years would find their way into the poems he would eventually comprise his collection Far Lake, published with the help of Robert Frost in 1930. These are photos that Wade Vandor took of Frost at Frost's rented house in Michigan. And we'll come around to that a little later. But that's Far Lake right there. It was early in 1922, returning to Michigan after his first extended stay in Canada, that he came upon a copy of Mountain Interval. Mountain Interval was Frost's third book of verse, and in it discovered a living writer with many of Thoreau's qualities. He wrote Frost a letter in which he introduced himself and expressed his wish to build a cabin near him in the mountains of New Hampshire. Frost responded with a letter that began as follows. I put the first paragraph of it up here. So it says, first about Thoreau. I like him as well as you do. In one book, Walden, he surpasses everything we have had in America. You have found this out yourself without my having told you. I have found it out myself without your having told me. Isn't it beautiful there can be such concert without collusion? That's the kind of getting together I can endure. Thus began a 40-year friendship. Wade Vandor is best known generally as a younger man who was encouraged and mentored by Frost and who worked for him, especially at the Gully Farm in South Shaftesbury. More particularly, he is remembered for composing a modest short poem titled simply The Echo, in which the speaker, calling from the shoreline of a remote body of water, is disappointed to hear only his own reverberating voice sounding off the opposite shore. So I'll read the poem now. And this is Wade Vandor's poem. I caution, it is modest. Made mellow by a wall of trees, my call came swiftly back to me. My word the forest would not take came bounding back across the lake. Through outer trees to shade grown black, I peered and saw like strips of snow that form in rocks the ages crack, the trunks of birches half aglow. Again I called, and now I stirred a fearful bird to swiftly fly. Far off I heard his angry scream, but not a gladdened human cry. It seemed I could not overthrow the brooding barrier of the trees. My voice grew swift, my call more keen, but always backward came the word of it to me that seemed to sigh. For him I sought for all reply. So that's the poem. I want to move on to Frost's poem now, the most of it, but before that I just want to make mention of two words that are in it. One geological, the other theological. Talus, a sloping mass of rock debris at the base of a cliff. In mountaineering, this is often called scree. And then embodiment, as I'm using it here, that which is invested with bodily form. All right. So yeah, and then the poem itself. This is the most of it. To the students present, I want to say it's easy to imagine that poetry is difficult, and I'm not going to disabuse you of that notion. I think very often it is. But one thing that helps to understand a poem when you're reading it or listening is to try try to imagine that it's a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Not every poem does, but many do, and this is an example of one that does. In addition to that, this is a story that is presented in a succession of images, that is pictures, some of which are oral or auditory. So you want to try to keep that in mind as well. Some are not. It is, as you'll hear it, as you're listening to it, it's a very noisy poem. That's one of the things that I find kind of remarkable about it. So if you can read it and follow along, I'm going to say the poem now. He thought he kept the universe alone, for all the voice in answer he could wake was but the mocking echo of his own from some tree-hidden cliff across the lake. Some morning from the boulder-broken beach, he would cry out on life that what it wants is not its own love back in copy speech, but counter-love, original response. And nothing ever came of what he cried, unless it was the embodiment that crashed in the cliff's talus on the other side. And then in the far distant water splashed, but after a time allowed for it to swim, instead of proving human when it neared, and someone else additional to him, as a great buck, it powerfully appeared, pushing the crumpled water up ahead, and landed pouring like a waterfall, and stumbled through the rocks with horny tread, and forced the underbrush. And that was all. So that's the poem. So just in comparing this to Vandor's poem, the most of it begins with the identical image of a man calling across a lake, crying out for counter-love, original response, and then also becoming disenchanted upon hearing his own echo. But the Frost poem takes the matter further. The man hears two successive noises, something that crashed into the talus on the other side, and then distant water splashing. I have images of these up here, and I just show these to you to see how they match what you may have been imagining. So there's our boulder-broken beach, and there's the, that is an Ontario lake. I don't think it's necessarily the one that Vandor was on, but that is an Ontario lake, and you can see the talus kind of floating down into the water. And there's the great buck pushing the crumpled water up ahead. I find that adjective crumpled kind of fascinating. Not a word that you would ordinarily use to describe something that's fluid or liquid. It's something that, we talk about with regard to something that's static and solid. But he needed a two-syllable word there, or he needed two syllables anyway to finish out the iambic pentameter line. I thought he could have used foamy, he could have used foaming, but he didn't. He used crumpled. He wanted hard consonants. Somehow it calls to mind to me the foam on sea spray that you see in a Japanese print, or else foam as it's not foam, but water spray that is attempted to be replicated in sculpture, bas relief, or something like that. There's something very, very static about it. I don't have a solid answer for it, but I think that's the beauty of it. For some reason, it works. It's just the perfect word. Just read this again. But the Frost poem takes the matter further. The man hears two successive noises, something that crashed into the talus on the other side, and then distant water splashing. Both sounds, presumably related, could be in response to his calling. Then what is first only heard becomes perhaps a thing actually visible. Not another person, but instead a large antlered deer comes swimming into view, arriving to the shore in which the man is standing to let the water pour off, and finally crashes through the underbrush. The poem ends with, "and that was all." In the first chapter of his memoir, Robert Frost and Wade Vandor, The Life of the Hired Man, Vandor sets the most of it next to the echo for purposes of comparison. He acknowledges anyone can see the resemblance. My poem sets the mood, a youthfully open, uncomplicated one. His far better and more impressive poem contains layers of suggestion, and it adds maturity of thought needed to ballast and give credence to the rather romantic picture of a lone man crying out for someone else additional to him in a primitive wilderness. Seen through the prism of Frost's philosophical dualism, in which he believed that human experience was comprised of endless things in pairs ordained to everlasting opposition, the man's encounter with the great buck is either a straightforward, albeit remarkable wildlife encounter, or else an extraordinary event expressing something beyond itself. The two contrasting possibilities hinge on the poem's ambiguous final word, all, a term suggesting perhaps either a disappointed acquiescence to a world without ulterior meaning, or something like, in Robert Pack's words, jubilation in witnessing a gesture of divine revelation, all, everything. To be sure, dualities can be found throughout the poem, but the poem as a whole, and the enigmatic concluding line in particular, cannot be easily fitted to any simple reductive framework. In his lengthy analysis of the poem, Richard Poirier offers a further way to consider the poem's final line, and that was all suggests something happened for which we have no better language. In his essay, The Subtlety of Robert Frost, Vandor tells us that Frost, skeptical of the efficacy of language to convey human experience, felt guilt about the presumptuous of using words. That's something that I find remarkable for a poet, to say something like that, or even to think that way. This is expressed in some of his writing, but I'm reading here from Vandor to try to convey the closeness of their relationship. Frost once told me, "At times I felt like paring my writing down until nothing was left but an exclamation point," which could be seen as the shortest poem ever written. Often I have scary doubts about words. Didn't Thoreau say, "If words were invented to conceal thought, then printing is a great improvement on a bad invention," or something like that? Writing is a kind of weakness, and once you get along in it, I expect the greatest thing would be not to write at all. Then we could hope that the act of non-writing would be seen as the ultimate gesture, like that look a dying person can give instead of words. It is fitting then that all stops us at the outer limit of language, ending the poem and pointing us toward the ineffable and the unknowable. If the great buck of the most of it embodies anything, it is certainly inarticulate power and primitive majesty, characteristic of whatever would be labeled wild. I have another slide here. Vandor tells us that the wilderness as a source intrigued Frost greatly, that he was always deeply concerned with sources. He felt he was tight against source material when he was in a forest, that he was fascinated by, even a little envious of, the adventures I had had, especially those I had had in Canada, and he had longed to live in or hard against the wilderness in Canada. These observations suggest that indeed Frost engaged in discussions and listened intently. Vandor's conversations with Frost about those experiences not only deepened Frost's admiration for his young friend, but offered him, through vicarious experience, an imaginative vista into a world to which he was instinctively drawn. As Robert Fagan reminds us, the figure of retreat, or perhaps backward motion to the source, primordial and original, can be found throughout Frost's work. Wade Vandor, at the beginning of Robert Frost and Wilderness, this is an article that he wrote, I think in the 1970s, relates the same impulse to the poet's life. All his life, Frost held his wanting to retire into the wilderness as a sort of threat, over the heads of his friends, relatives, and the world. It was as if he stood as a deer at the edge of a forest, ready to leap into it and disappear forever. His poem, An Empty Threat, which Vandor quotes in this article's beginning as well, begins with these alluring lines. I stay, but it isn't as if there wasn't always Hudson's Bay and the fur trade, a small skiff and a paddle blade. Taking the poem's author and its speaker to be one, Vandor suggests that although Frost's many commitments made him stay where he was, he could take solace in the knowledge that withdrawal to wild places was always possible, if only through the imagination. Wade Vandor's experiences in Canada played a larger role in the genesis of the most of it than is perhaps generally understood. Indicative of this are numerous similarities between the narrative accounts of his time in Ontario as they appear in The Life of the Hired Man and the images and ideas present in the Frost poem itself. It is more than likely that much of what he wrote in the memoir regarding his Northwoods adventures he shared with Frost in conversation. Their talks surely touched upon much that the younger man had learned in the Canadian wilderness, both broadly and particularly regarding the interplay of sound and silence and the consequences of choosing wilderness solitude over civilization, as both found their way into The Echo and Man Alone. Man Alone is a second poem of the same theme that Vandor wrote. As a philosophical dualist, Frost would perhaps have recognized these paired opposites as they surfaced in conversations, as well as those contained in Echoing itself, giving voice and listening and projecting and receiving. Richard Poyer suggests that Vandor's poem provided no more than a nudge, if that, pushing Frost in the direction of a poem already waiting in him to be written. He places Frost's poem within the large poetic context of Echoing, a context that includes both Milton's Comus, as well as Wordsworth's The Boy of Winander in the Book 5 of the Prelude. Poyer states that also that the most of it brings into sharper focus many of Frost's poems about echoing, and shows the degree to which his poetry absorbs and continually comments upon the echoing streams, hills, and rocks of pastoral poetry. Frost often said, I do write literary criticism, it's all in my poems, and there it is. While Frost was well versed in the echo motif in literature, he recognized that Vandor was not. In a letter to his younger friend dated February 25, 1925, he wrote this: Your writing pleases me for a vein of thinking that is all your own. I'm glad you are so much of a real poet. I find much of this really lovely and original, underivative. Vandor's own direct experience of sound resonating in the wilderness of Canada was the singular source of his poems, and Frost's complimentary term underivative reflects perfectly his appreciative understanding of this. The record of Wade Vandor's initiation into life in the North Woods, insofar as those experiences are documented in his memoir, is replete with descriptions of both sound and silence and the varying emotions that they elicited in Ed Long and in himself. Remember, Ed Long was his friend from Dearborn that went with him that first summer. I like Wade Vandor's prose writing better than his poetry. It's much more, some would call it purple prose and flowery, but to me he gets his point across here. There is no simile delicate enough to describe the thread-like tingling weavings of quietness which in the north endlessly drift and turn over under supports of silence. Sometimes I imagined I could hear atoms of silence turning into other elements. Sometimes silence was my nourishment, and I would wait to hear it dotted with little flecks of sound. The tick-like bite of a wood borer eating near me in a dead tree, an owl's hoot so far away, so faint, it was like a dream drifting, burying reality. Most of the time we just sat and read and listened, and we had no will to escape the loneliness that surrounded us. It is in the following passage from The Life of the Hired Man that Vandor speaks with even more specificity to the experiences that prefigure the themes presented in both The Echo and Man Alone, and to a greater degree in the most of it, namely the natural world first enticing and then, if not defeating expectations, altering or redirecting them. This again is his writing. The polished scenery was almost painfully perfect, the time exactly right. Yet somehow our responses did not completely correlate with our surroundings. We waited for something to happen that never happened. Like a cat crouched ready to spring, like an arrow drawn back on its bow, nature constantly seemed poised to express something extraordinary. In both The Echo and Man Alone, excepting possibly the pitiable cabin mouse at the end of the latter, I haven't read that poem, the man's calling goes unanswered. But Frost's poem not only gives fuller expression to the man's desire and anticipation for someone else additional to him, but answers the need by offering, if not precisely what is desired, something extraordinary nonetheless. That is the great buck, which Vandor himself, as he makes clear in the passage above, had in actual fact been longing for. So, back to... Here's a photo of, that's Wade Vandor on the left, and that's Anderson, his older friend with the hunting rifle on the right. And that would have been taken the winter of that first year. When Ed Long decided that he had had his fill of wilderness tranquility, he returned to Michigan. Vandor stayed on in Ontario through late fall into early winter that year, partnering for a time with C.E. Anderson, a friendly older man whose wilderness skills he held in high regard. Vandor recounts how one night after their supper had been eaten, he had a remarkable experience with echoes. The two men went out for a pleasure row, taking the rowboat to an island from which they could get a view of most of the lake. Sitting quietly in the boat, Anderson told his companion to listen. Then Vandor watched as Anderson drew in his breath sharply, then let out a scratching screech such as I had never heard produced by a human throat. Anderson then told him to count the echoes. There were an astounding 9 altogether, each softer than the previous, the last not as loud as the fall of a match on a soft rug. This experience with echoing is treated in the memoir as something significant, and as such it would have been just the sort of episode he would have shared with Frost. Wade Vandor relished solitude and all that accompanied enough to return to Ontario for 9 successive years, in stating, I had often confided in Frost my strange adventures in silence and loneliness in the lake country of northwest of Lake Superior, and that Frost plainly used me as a copy. Vandor meant more than the figure of a man calling across a remote lake was modeled after him. He meant that Frost's poem evoked much of what he had himself been feeling and thinking. If the prose record in his memoir concerning his time there even loosely approximates all that he had told Frost in conversation, then clearly Frost drew inspiration not only from Vandor's poems, but more broadly and more deeply from what the younger man had told him in conversation as well. Conversation. Conversation was to Robert Frost an art almost equal to poetry. He was praised by his contemporaries as one of the greatest talkers of all time, one of the greatest conversationalists of the 20th century, and one of the master conversationalists of his age, of this age. But good conversation is by definition reciprocal. And Frost's abilities to listen, to absorb what was said to him, to remember, to work what he heard over in his mind and to contextualize what he heard into his capacious body of knowledge were by many accounts equally impressive. Frost and Vandor's first lengthy face-to-face conversations took place at Frost's rented house in Ann Arbor in late fall and winter of 1925, and also into the spring of the following year. He was at that time fellow in letters at the University of Michigan. Vandor was queried intensively during these talks about his time in the Ontario wilderness and it is probable that therein the seed for the most of it was planted. Here is his evocative description of a 2-hour conversation in the sitting room of the house on Pontiac Road in Ann Arbor that took place in February of 1926. And I put this up here. This was one of Frost's favored pedagogical postures, I think you could call it. There are many descriptions of him slouched in chairs and divans and sofas and so forth while he's talking, while he's teaching, while he's mentoring, if you will. But Wade Vandor records that that's what he was doing here. So this is this is Vandor's writing. I arrived at his house around 1:30, and after Frost had questioned me about my experiences in the Canadian woods, he slumped in the davenport near the fire and permitted talk to overpower all the velvet influences that lined the hour. And then the colorful books on the bookshelves did not matter. The proximity of the University of Michigan did not matter. Modulated by all the emotions of his being, his voice, regenerating words, went on and on as a manifestation of all that is human in the genus man. It was like being laved in talk, tucked in talk. It was a kind of strolling, fern-picking, apple-noticing talk whose core was rich with polished seeds of sanity. It was a measuring talk that, inching along with words, somehow stretched both ordinary and poetry people into wider standards of meaning. Sometimes it went carefully as if over a stream's slippery stepping stones. Then, like sandpaper, it cheerfully rubbed institutions as if to grind away some of the sadness from them. Like a slow plow, his voice moved and turned up words of wisdom. Never before had I heard such talk, and then I realized I was hearing poetry, the poetry of talk. So far had this man leaned into the art of poetry, he was permeated with it, mated to it. So drawing from Frost's poetry, George Bagby has deduced what Frost believed to be the means by which a person might find meaning in the natural world, all of which Bagby insists were deeply rooted in Thoreau. George Bagby is a recently retired English professor at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia. He wrote an excellent critical book called Robert Frost and the Book of Nature. So these are his ideas. What's remarkable to me about them is the degree to which Wade Vandor had in essence already embraced them. He understood these things intuitively. He didn't need to read about them, and nor did he need to have Frost tell him this stuff. So we'll go through them one by one. That's the first, I think. Yeah. The observer who wants to see more in nature than an inanimate, cold world needs to cultivate three interrelated conditions. That's the first. The first of the three conditions, is straightforward. According to Bagby, Frost believed that a person desiring to experience a vision or revelation in nature had to first almost inevitably isolate himself temporarily from normal contact with other human beings. This is evinced by the fact that the great majority of Frost's most penetrating insights are won in isolation. One of the things I find intriguing about these principles or these actions is that they get increasingly difficult. The first one, most of us have experienced. We walk into the woods to be alone. So what? But it gets harder. The second condition requires some elucidation. A person needed to engage in a kind of imaginative adventurousness, a deliberate breaking from daily or domestic routine, allowing the person to push outward in search of novel experiences. Bagby insists that without the readiness to encounter new experiences in a realm different from and larger than oneself, solitude would be purposeless if not destructive. Thoreau speaks to the idea in the conclusion of Walden, labeling it extravagance. He separated the two words. There's a hyphen between extra and vagance, employing the words' Latin roots and the word's oldest, now obsolete meaning, extra meaning outside of or beyond, and vagary meaning to wander, hence to wander beyond the limits. You see the root of vagabond and vague in that as well. Aside from Frost's poetry, the most salient example in his life was moving with his family to England. Wade Vandor came by extravagance naturally. He writes, "Seldom did I think of myself as being a rebel against convention in the early days. It was more like wanting to do something. I simply saw no barrier against doing it." And I think the photographs that you've seen of him up here evince that. The second paragraph of Economy, remember Economy is the first chapter of Walden, contains Thoreau's well-known defense of writing from the viewpoint of the self about the self. "I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. Unfortunately, I am confined to this theme by the narrowness of my experience." This concern, embedded paradoxically in a passage in which he venerates I, or the first person, is carried over into the book's conclusion, where he speaks further of his apprehension. "I fear chiefly lest my expression may not be extravagant enough, may not wander far enough beyond the narrow limits of my daily experience, so as to be adequate to the truth of which I have been convinced." One obvious means for a writer to escape being confined by the narrowness of his experience is to use elements of another's life as the basis for poetic creation. The most of it because it came into being in part through Frost's learning about experiences largely novel to him, is the product of extravagance, the sort that Thoreau, it seems, had wished for. In his last lecture before a collegiate audience given at Dartmouth on November 27, 1962, entitled simply On Extravagance, Frost picked up Thoreau's thread, expanding his idea while embracing further definitions of the word. This was given at the Hopkins Center shortly after it was opened. And he began the talk talking about the Hopkins Center as being extravagant. It's this big new building, and the college spent a lot of money on it and so forth. But so imbued with Thoreau's thinking was Frost that he spoke that evening, as George Monteiro has pointedly indicated, without feeling the need to mention Thoreau at all. Early in the talk, Frost spoke of extravagance as a form of metaphor by which he appears to have meant the kernel of an idea or else a story expanded upon or elaborated. Reading the most of it as an example, he offered an impromptu gloss on its first line. See, just that one line could be the whole poem, you know. The rest of it was an expansion of it. So on to the third principle. This, in my mind, is the tough one. The third and final condition for finding meaning is the necessity of cooperating with natural forces in order to be overwhelmed by and ultimately lost in them. In his very first meeting with Vandor, which took place unexpectedly on a Littleton, New Hampshire railroad platform on September 4th, 1922, Frost immediately questioned the younger man about his experiences in Canada, and Vandor recalls, in response to a remark I made about getting lost in the woods, he said that all of us at times want to get lost, actually, or in shades of allegory. I might mention he was with Walter Hendrix that day. Vandor had been camped out in Hendrix's cabin in Franconia, and the two of them drove into Littleton in Walter's cart. He had a small farm there, and he had a horse that could pull them and so forth. Their purpose was to meet Walter's mother, who was coming out from Chicago. They had no expectation that they were going to run into Robert Frost. The theme surfaces again in a letter dated November 4th, 1930, in which Frost wrote to him regarding the recent publication of Far Lake. It's a good little book, and I'm proud to have it dedicated to me. The best poem in the book, and the first one, is lost for some reason connected with the larger form of the whole. The letter ends with this advice: I must leave it to you to choose your way. Immerse, all but lose yourself in the next phase. Get rid of the last traces of me. Revel in your recklessness. Having heard his stories of the Canadian woods and read his poems, Frost surely appreciated that Vandor had understood the three interconnected conditions without his needing to tell him, just as Vandor's reading of Thoreau gave firmer voice to what he had himself already intuited. While Walden was a very important book to Frost, Wade Vandor took his life's bearings from it, never wavering from his conviction to live his life in accord with the principles it set forth. In the fall of 1972, 9 years after his friend's death, Vandor wrote in retrospect, "The three major happenings in my life were these: the finding of Thoreau's writings, my living in the Canadian wilderness, and my friendship with Robert Frost. It would be hard to say which of these was the most important." To borrow a phrase from the great poem that in one sense belongs to them both, counter-love original response is the very definition of any friendship that is more than a simple balanced mathematical reciprocity. Like most friendships, theirs was initiated by common interest sustained through shared experiences, the giving and returning of deeds and favors, and all underlain with mutual goodwill. Frost's statement in his first letter to Vandor regarding their mutual admiration of Thoreau as being concert without collusion, and consequently the kind of getting together I can endure, was prescient in at least two ways. First, Thoreau would be a wellspring from which both men, each in his own way, would continue to draw. And second, the large measure of freedom and independence that each was to allow the other was instrumental in helping their friendship endure for 4 decades. The most of it has been called one of the greatest poems ever written by an American. Descended from a long Western tradition, it calls to mind Adam in the garden desiring an Eve. It evokes the words of the prophet Isaiah, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, and it follows in the long tradition of echo literature made mention earlier. It speaks universally to the need for companionship, be it human or divine, as well as for meaning in a cosmos that seems to not always answer our desires. But it is also the product of a friendship of two unique men who talked, wrote, and lived much of their lives in the presence of a third. Thank you. Are we ready to start? Go ahead.
So you foreshadowed a potential conversation about gender equity. So I thought I would just
Oh, gosh.
go ahead and kick
All
it
Yeah,
on.
I wrote down some ideas. I think about 5 or 10 minutes before starting, and this is and this isn't to excuse it or it's just these are just ideas. I think and other people have more. Coeducation was not as prevalent then as it is today, and the two schools that he was most closely associated with, Dartmouth College and Amherst College, were both all men at that time. This is sort of some quasi-amateur psychology work, but he never had the opportunity to, at least he never had the opportunity to father one of his sons, Elliot, who died at 4 years old, something he blamed himself for the rest of his life. And then Carol, who died, I think, at the age of 38, and he died by his own hand. And so he felt he was unsuccessful in that regard. And it may be that, you know, he was accommodating for that. But clearly to me, he had a he had a fundamental need to do this, to mentor young men. That's what he did. I think I think as often as he could, he saw himself in them, and any time there was any kind of a parallel, that would that would come through. I do think that a lot of them had. There was a paradox in the relationship in all these cases, because he was in sometimes in a kind of an opaque way, holding himself up as an example, or his young life up as an example, which is break free, do what you want, follow your dream, that kind of thing, which is exactly what he did. But he was but he was telling them to be independent at the same time. So that's how do you break free from somebody who has that kind of hold on you? It's not easy. He did befriend frequently. He worked toward women through the young men, that is, their girlfriends and their wives and so forth. He got to know them, and so you can kind of look at it that way. He did visit women's colleges frequently. He was at Mount Holyoke frequently. He was on his trips down to Florida, where his winter home was. He had a habit of stopping at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, which is and still is a women's college. But he did mentor his own daughter, Leslie. I mean, if you call, I'm not sure where fathering leaves off and mentoring begins, but he certainly offered her advice and helped her in every way he could. And also, as I was reminded as I walked in and saw the book display that Kathy Burris made for us up here, there's a recently published one of that Leslie Lee Francis, his granddaughter, put together, and that's up there. So he certainly mentored both those granddaughters. So. I think that's about it. There's one thing. This is something that I came across just the other day. Here he is sitting on the steps of a building at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. The woman. Woman sitting right here is named Jean Louise Stelfox. She only met him once on this day, but he made enough of an impact on her that she determined at that life to give her life over to literature. She became a high school English teacher and a much respected one in her hometown. So there's that's an example of what. I mean, Frost would have called that, sometimes you just need to touch the hem, and that's what she did that day. She just, he had enough, he just said the right things to her, and it all just happened. It all fell into place. So, I think that's about all I can say about that. I mean, there's. The rest is everything I said is speculation, and I don't really know. I think there were gender divisions at that time that don't exist today, but even today, cross-gender mentoring is kind of a delicate matter, I think. So, anyone else? Yeah.
What drew you to Robert Frost? And when was the first time you read his work?
Like most people, I haven't. There's a lot of interesting stories, but I did not study Frost as an undergraduate. I studied Irish literature, and after college, I went to Ireland to continue my. Some years after college, I went over to Ireland to continue my study of William Butler Yeats and things associated with the Irish literary Renaissance. At the school I was at, I met this this man who became a very good friend. He was an Irish academic who I won't say couldn't stand Yeats, but didn't have a great deal of respect for William Butler Yeats. But he had enormous respect for Frost. Had never been to America. So he and I, he knew I was from Vermont, and we just got to be good friends. So it was largely through his influence that pushed me ahead with Frost on kind of an academic path. That's really a lot of it, I think. So it's kind of interesting that I'm from here but had to go to Ireland to learn about Robert Frost.
You talk about Frost threatening to light out for the territory, but never quite does it, at least not in the way that Vandor did. What do you think he saw in Vandor that symbolized that yearning, that desire, or something ineffable, something though that spoke to him that he himself never perhaps materially achieved? It had to do with immersion in
Well, I think you're kind of hinting at it already. He was. Vandor dropped out of school in ninth grade, so he never had to tell him to drop out of school. And he was famous for doing this. I know there are some college administrators here, and I don't want to give any students the wrong idea, but Frost really was terribly fond of telling students to leave college, get out, follow your dream. You don't belong here. What are you doing here? And again, he's so he never had to say that. He did, in fact. Jeffrey Hendrix, Walter Hendrix's son, who went on to Immerse, and was one of the people that Frost told to leave. He said, drop out. This is when he was a junior. There's no reason why you need this degree. You're an artist. Just go do it. I think to try to answer your question, I think Vandor embodied what he could have been had he not chosen to raise a family, marry, and commit himself to all these responsibilities. So it was, he gave him this. One interesting thing happened later that I find kind of fascinating. After Eleanor died, and Frost was spending most of the warm months up in Ripton, he asked Wade Vandor if he'd come on as his regular hired man. And you'd think, and that bespeaks of Frost's need that at that time for companionship. His wife of many years died, and he needed a companion. He needed someone to be there with him, somebody that could, they could talk about the haying. They could talk about, how to use, how to sharpen an axe the right way, but also poetry and so on and so forth. Anyone else would have said sure, but Wade Vandor said no. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to, and that really hurt Frost. So.
Did he ever say why?
Well, he didn't want to be tied down. He never really he never wanted to be tied down. He even had written into, he eventually did marry, but into the sort of contract that he had with his wife was, anytime one or the other of us wants to leave, we can. I want you to understand that. And that is the marriage did dissolve eventually. He wanted total freedom. He really did.
Just for those who have forgotten or perhaps didn't know, brief bit of biography of Frost. I want to know how much older he was than Van Dorn. When was he born? And did he have any episodes in his youth of that sort of freedom, whether it was travel to Europe or travel in the wilderness or anything of that sort? I'm unacquainted.
Frost was 2 years old when George Armstrong Custer was killed. So he's born in 1874. Wade Vandor was born in 1899. So there's quite a difference there. Vandor is young enough to have been his son. Regarding his attempts at escape, I mean, I think perhaps the most the most famous, or maybe infamous would be a better word, was his leaving New England to go down to the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina when he was when he was very young. What happened was Eleanor went off to college by herself. She went up to St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. He went up there and brought 2 self-published books, one for her, one for him. It took him a lot of effort to get up there from Lawrence and Massachusetts. And she basically slammed the door in his face. I'm not going to marry you now. Wait. So he went back in as a way of, self-drama, pathos. He took off to the Dismal Swamp in an effort to. He doesn't really know what he was doing. He was going to get lost. He was going to kill himself. It's not really clear, but that was his big kind of wilderness adventure, and he had to prove something to himself. I mean, he was really not mentally healthy at that time. I mean, he was really he wasn't just mad at her and upset because she said no. I mean, he was mad at his mother. He was mad at the world for not understanding him, and so on and so forth. So that was Laurance Thompson, his authorized biographer, went down there and tried to track the whole track where he was in different parts of the Dismal Swamp and all that stuff. And that's severe frostbite. Yeah.
What was the name of that poem about that Frost described his desire for escapism?
That was called An Empty Threat.
Thank you.
That was called An Empty Threat. And empty was what it was. And empty suggests that, I'm thinking about this, but I'm not really going to do it. Mike?
What you were saying about DeVore not accepting the job makes me wonder if any of his mentorship can be disruptive,
Mhm.
exhaustive,
Mhm.
particularly for the mentees.
Yeah.
Especially if,
Yeah.
you're going off to college and somebody says, what are you doing? Quit. That sort of thing. Were there people that he was in a mentor relationship with that simply sort of reached their limits with him, where they didn't find it apparently as inspiring as the
Could you repeat the question?
No, I don't think.
He asked if,
Can, I hope you can.
Mike was saying, Mike was acknowledging a truth, I think, and that is that there comes a point in a mentor-mentee relationship when the mentee just has to move on. I've had enough. So, and Mike was wondering if there are any examples of that. I think probably the best is Wade Vandor. When he was asked that question, he was well into his 40s by then. So he really didn't, and Frost is always, pushing him back. It was, and calling him forward at the same time. He was kind of confused, I suppose. I'm looking into some more of these. If you ask me 3 or 4 years from now, I might have a more comprehensive answer. We'll see. But right now, I don't know. The next one I'm looking into is John Bartlett, who stayed pretty close to him all along. That reminds me also of this is another thing that complicates it. Frost told Vandor at one point, "You find a farm and I'll buy it. That is, I will buy it for you." Now he didn't find a farm. He found a small house in southwestern Massachusetts or northwestern Connecticut. It's unclear from the book exactly where it was. But Frost paid for it, and Frost paid for also the materials and the work that needed to be done on it as well. And Vandor took the money. He didn't think anything of it. It was just the way it was. But John Bartlett, another of his mentees, had financial difficulties after marriage when he was getting a young family started, and Frost thought nothing of giving him money too. These were not loans; these were outright grants. So there's a great deal of generosity there. Kathy, you had a question.
I was intrigued by that third instruction he offered about cooperating with natural forces and allowing them to overwhelm you. Are there examples from his own life of him having done that?
The Dismal Swamp Adventure would be the classic one. Yeah. I think of, I was thinking about it this afternoon. I mean, if any of you have read John Muir's The Mountains of California, I mean, there's two beautiful examples in that where, this is a guy who climbs to the top of a ponderosa pine during a lightning storm and waits for it to sway back and forth and, screams in joy as it's happening. And that's, or sliding down a mountain in an avalanche, hooray. Any questions? Yeah.
Emerson was 14 years older than Thoreau. Was there a mentor similarity there?
That's something I've never thought of, but that's something I had never thought of. But sure, I mean, I think I think there would be multiple similarities, but also and the biggest one that I can think of that comes to mind that's pretty obvious is Thoreau moving against Emerson. Thoreau pushing against Emerson and going out and doing his own thing.
On Emerson's line.
Yeah. I think, probably the reason I didn't think of it is that Vandor wasn't, he's not a great literary figure. His His poems are very modest. Nobody reads The Life of the Hired Man. I think the reason for that is that I have most of the copies. You know.
Did Frost ever ask anyone else to help him or live with him? Did he die alone?
Well, his the great love of his life after Eleanor's death was Kay Morrison. There's no question about that. Although I think some of the more puritanical folks I know insist that nothing ever took place between them. But I think if you read the letters, the published letters carefully, and look into some of the other stuff, he fell madly in love with her, and how that was. She was married, and but we have to be careful in thinking about it and talking about it, because it's easy enough to say that, you know, something like that happens and the man is guiltless and cavalier and all of that. That wasn't the case at all. Frost felt terrible about it and didn't quite know what to do. But he was just so confused at that point in his life that that was just the situation. It was short-lived. Maybe you know, his. It wasn't maybe so much of a love affair as kind of a mad crush that was over in 2 years or 2.5 years, something like that. After which she remained his personal secretary really to the end of his life. So and that meant handling everything from you know, where he was going to speak to who was going to drive him to one place or another and everything like that. I don't think she lived in later years. His domicile was on Brewster Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I don't think she lived there with him. I think she couldn't have because she was married, but she was close enough that she was there every day, cleaning things up and talking to him about what was coming next and stuff like that. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure if okay. Yeah. Steve?
Your description of their relationship makes me think about, you know, Vandor and how Frost was kind of getting as much from him as he was getting from Frost in terms of kind of this source of material for this ideal that he had, almost this romantic ideal of being alone in the wilderness. And it puts me a little bit in mind, not to channel Jim Keikos too much, but you know, like Kerouac with Neil Cassidy,
Yeah.
you know, kind of latching onto this person who embodies this ideal that they can't themselves attain.
That's it. You put it very well. I think that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
Do you think there are other of his mentees? I noticed you avoided that word very successfully in your speech, but were there others who he also sort of glommed onto in that way, who had other experiences that he might have made use of in his writing? You'll find out.
As with Mike, I'll tell you 4 or 5 years from now. You know, my next look is into John Bartlett, and that's intriguing because the two lives were so parallel. Frost falls in love with his the girl that is in his high school class. John Bartlett does too. Same thing. They both have the same number of children. Frost goes to Dartmouth, drops out after 3 months. Bartlett goes to Middlebury, drops out after 3 months. Frost has problems with asthma, with breathing. Bartlett does too. It's on and on and on and on. The parallels are amazing. And Frost saw all of this, and there was something in him that really liked it, you know. I don't know. There's a, yeah, there are others. to me, Vandor is always, at least so far, he's the most interesting, just because of the life that he led. He went on to, he lived, he does have associations with here, particularly with Marlboro. There aren't a lot of people that know about it, but before Marlboro became a college, he was invited by Walter up there to live in what today is Hendrix House. So, which is where Walter and his family stayed in the summertime. So, Vandor, his wife, and his young son overwintered there one winter. He kind of circled back years later, and in 1950, Walter Hendrix hired him to be Marlboro College's first poet in residence. I doubt very much that there was any remuneration, but that happened. And he had associations with the music school. He was a vocal soloist, and he worked as a piano tuner for them during that time. Piano tuning was really the only career that he ever undertook, and that was very late in life. But he just, for some reason, decided he liked it. So,
I want to thank everyone very much for your time. Thank you so much.